Hello, everyone. You're all welcome along to this event as part of the Dublin Festival of History. This is the 10th year of the festival, and I hope you've been enjoying it. There's still 3 or 4 days of events to come. This year, we've been, I suppose, taking an approach of in-person events and some online events. And one of the great aspects of online events is that it allows us to look a little bit further from home for speakers. I first encountered the work of Donal McCracken many years ago when I was researching Ireland and the Boer War, the Second Boer War. His 1999 study of Major John McBride and his Irish Brigade was a groundbreaking piece of research. And then came Forgotten Protest, which looked at the many impacts of the Boer War, the Second Boer War, on Irish life, from local politics to Gaelic football and everything else imaginable. But McCracken is one of our most diverse historians. He's interested in, amongst other things, environmental history. Before we came on live, we're talking about Napoleon's Garden, of all things, media history and the Irish diaspora, especially in South Africa, where he joins us from today. And today he's going to be speaking to us about his latest book, the best title of a book I've come across in a long, long time, You Will Die at Midnight, Victorian Threatening Letters. The blurb of the book is fantastic. Victorian Ireland was global champion of threatening letters. Donal's going to bring us through that new work. Now, at the end of it, there will be time for some questions. So if you have questions as we go along, ask them in the chat box, and I'll put as many of them as possible to Donal at the end. But for now, Donal, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Donal, the Donal Show. And thank you, folks, for attending. It's good to be part of the Dublin History Festival. I've had various comments made to me about the study that I've done. One friend said to me that I'd created a great manual for the disgruntled of Dublin. And another said that I could make an absolute bomb by being a threatening letter consultant. I could both write threatening letters that people could buy and use in their workplace, or I could track down threatening letter writers. So those are a couple of thoughts I have in mind. What I'm going to be doing this evening is, I'll just do the share screen here. I hope that comes up nice and clear, is to look at this phenomenon of Irish threatening letters in Ireland in the 19th century. The threatening letter was not unique to Ireland, of course, but it was most noticeable in Ireland. And you know, whilst in England you had the poison pen letter, and you had the blackmailer's letter. In Ireland, we didn't stoop to those things. We had the classic threatening letter, and it's about that I want to talk to you this evening. The simple Irish pastime of sending a threatening letter to one's neighbour, a widely employed criminal act of intimidation to create fear and extract a result, was well embedded in Irish rural culture long before the potato crop failed. But it was in the Victorian era, from the 1830s through really till the end of the 1880s, in the Victorian era, that threatening letters were the scourge of rural Ireland. And I thought it was a good idea to start with a graph. And this is from statistics, official police statistics, RIC statistics, annual statistics that were gathered. Because when some people gained threatening letters, the first thing they did was take it into the police barracks and give it to the sergeant of police. And they meticulously recorded every letter that was handed in. And so you can build up a picture throughout the reign of this phenomenon. And it is inaccurate for a variety of reasons, but it's not so inaccurate that it doesn't give you a fairly good picture of when the phenomenon was at its worst or at its best, depending which way you look at things, and when it had sunk down and it wasn't so important. And it is when you might expect it to be. You've got there on the left, the famine years, and all that went with that. And then further on the right there, you'll see during the land war, when you have an extraordinary explosion of these letters. Now, the police collected, I reckon, over 36,000 of these. 36,000 of these were handed in to police stations. But that was only the tip of the iceberg. It's difficult to know what the exact total was, but I think if you had a multiplier of at least 10, you would get somewhere near it. A Mayo magistrate wrote in the 1880s to the chief secretary, threatening letters almost innumerable. And some of the people that got threatening letters are the sort of people you would expect to get threatening letters, like the hapless Captain Boycott. And he admitted having a writing cabinet crammed full of threatening letters. Equally, you would expect the wicked land agents to be in receipt, the land agents who stood between the landlords and the tenant farmers, to be in receipt of such letters. And this was Hussey, who was the greatest of the land agents. And you can see a very fine house he had for himself. He basically had a land agent running company that he ran. And he wrote, threatening letters count for nothing. I have had over 100 in my time, yet I'll die in my bed for all of that. And he did die in his bed for all of that. Although, as you can see from this, they tried to blow him up on one occasion, and a very poor effort they made of it. If you look at the statistics and you start crunching the numbers and you start bubbling it down, this is the picture that you get. And you can see the counties where it was particularly problematic and the counties where it was less so. Rural Munster, and especially Tipperary, I'm not sure if anyone from Tipperary watching this evening, led with the highest ratings reported of threatening letters, followed by Leinster, that is the counties of Westmeath, Offaly, Longford and Meath, and Roscommon, and just going over the border there into Roscommon, into Connaught, into Roscommon and Leitrim. In fact, the Meath, Westmeath, Roscommon thing, sort of that area around Kells. I have a friend who lives in Kells, and I tell him he's the centre of the threatening letter world. With then Ulster leading the rear, much less so in the north. The threatening letter sometimes had an impact, but the threat contained in the threatening letter was very rarely carried out. Though shots might be fired through a kitchen window or cattle maimed, something which Michael Davitt strongly denounced. The threatening letter was an additional stage between spreading malicious rumor and gossip and taking risky practical action against an individual, which might result in one being hanged. And one wouldn't want that, would one? So it was a nice middle ground to go if you were out to get someone a threatening letter. They were regarded as what was classified as an outrage. And there were two sorts of outrage. There were agrarian outrages and there were general outrages. And here's a graph of the two of them. Now, most threatening letters were agrarian, though a lot of general ones were too. And it boiled down to how do you define an agrarian threatening letter. For instance, a letter that was delivered in a town, in a market town, but related to the country and to land ownership, was regarded as a general outrage, but quite clearly it was a rural event. So it's a fairly wobbly concept, the whole thing of what type of outrage these letters were. There were various contemporaries who at times published about it, wrote about it. This marvelous cover to a book, and It gives, very much, you cannot judge a book by its covers. The actual book itself is not too bad. But you know what publishers can be like when they say a good sale with a book cover. This is by Baron Aston of the County Galway. And there were several pamphlets relating directly to threatening letters. This was a one, see, by Rory of the Hills, who was actually pursing Harrington Fitzgerald, who was an artist and a writer at the time. And then there was another one, which I don't have the cover from, which is a pity because it's a very lurid cover, the threatening letter writer and Irish loyalist companion by Patrick O'Connor McLaughlin. So it was known at the time, and it was the subject of comment in print. Who wrote these letters, these threatening letters, and who received these threatening letters? Now, I think if you looked at it from the cold, you would say, well, it's quite obvious who wrote them. The tenant class wrote them against the wicked landlord. And of course they did, to a degree, though not to the degree as you would expect. The vast bulk of them were in actual fact not so much that as other things. Here's a lovely cartoon, the St. Valentine's Day in Ireland. And on the left, you can see the writer of a threatening letter, and you can tell it's a threatening letter because there's a coffin on the letter, and you can tell they're no good because there's the landlord, a land league poster behind them, and also you can see that they're drinking heavily. So that's that side, and then on the other side you have the landlord, and the wee girl has come up to him and says, "Father, is this for you, Father? Is it fun?" And of course that just says everything, doesn't it? Or does it? Landlords, land agents, magistrates, but very, very rarely police officers. Very, very rarely did the RIC ever receive any threatening letters. The writers of threatening letters weren't altogether stupid, and it was one thing writing a letter to the land agent; it was another thing writing it to the sergeant of police. But equally numerous, if not more numerous, were threatening letters written by tenant farmers to tenant farmers. And in particular, the sons of tenant farmers, those young unmarried males that were such an important and have been highlighted by historians in recent years in rural unrest in 19th century Ireland. Who received them? Land grabbers, people who occupied farms that had been, people who had been evicted, not so much evicted tenants themselves. There seems to have been a tradition that they did not write a threatening letter to whoever had evicted them, but rather a member of the family, or a member or a relative or a friend of the family would write the set piece letter protesting against the eviction. There was also, and there's a graph I put in the book, which tries to correlate the three things of threatening letters, which are in blue there. You can see it being very high, and then joining the other graph, evictions. And of course, evictions are a complicated matter because you've got reinstatement as well as the evictions, but that didn't stop the letter writing. And then moonlighting, the going out after dark and burning hayricks or shooting through windows or nailing notices, threatening notices to barn doors or whatever, and trying to see how the relationship follows. They follow each other as they go along. There was another type of people who received letters, and that was those people who wrote threatening letters to themselves. And the police were very well aware of this and were very conscious of this phenomenon. Why did they do it? And there are several reasons, some of them very practical indeed, leaving aside the desire to gain victim status. They were often used to extract one from an embarrassing obligation. And there was an example I found of a guy who had contracted to paint a landlord's castle. And then the landlord is boycotted, but he's under contract. So what does he do? He writes threatening letters to himself. He then goes, out into the bars and he says, look, I've been threatened, you know, I can't do this. He goes to the landlord and said, I've been threatened. I can't do this job. It's more than my life's worth, to extract himself from something that otherwise would be very embarrassing. This was not a male occupation. Both women and men were involved in writing threatening letters. I put this picture in of the Women's Land League, and it's always tickled me. And I've never seen anyone observe or comment that the women, the ladies in the picture, are all involved in one way or another in writing letters, putting letters in postbags, writing them, reading them, what have you. And I have no doubt, although it is very difficult to prove, as it is with everything relating to threatening letters, that the Ladies' Land League were not slow to send landlords the odd letter, unsigned or signed by Rory of the Hills, where they felt it was necessary. And the police were aware of what they rather nicely, quaintly referred to as a lady's hand. And this was an example of a lady's hand with two coffins, because she was out for two people, not just one person, and receiving letters too. It wasn't just writing letters; women receiving. Famous in my mind anyway, Mary O'Callaghan of Tully in the County Clare, who received a lot of these letters. And the postman refused to deliver the letters to the house. So she used to walk down to Tully post office, and she always carried a gun under her arm, and was never molested, because in the locality it was known that Mary O'Callaghan could bring down a rabbit 300 meters. So no one was going to, no one was going to interfere with that lady. Secret societies. Secret societies were involved in the practice, and quite widely involved in the practice. The Ribbon Men, the Molly Maguires also indulged, usually against tenant farmers who had displeased them. It tended to be against, this is why you cannot really talk about threatening letters, as being a purely class thing. It wasn't. And in this case, it wasn't so much. It tended to be farmers who had displeased them that received the letters, and they were quite patronizing about it. And often it wasn't a threatening letter; it was a threatening notice, which is slightly different. Here's a threatening notice. Notice how it's all in capitals to disguise the hand, because there was a great game being played of identifying handwriting taking place while all this phenomenon was undertaking. A boycott notice by one of these ribbon societies, and rather than to a particular individual. But it became more sophisticated. Printing presses were used, and there's a lovely example of the Kerry Sentinel. Yes, the Kerry Sentinel. Using its presses to roll out these threatening notices. This one, a long and rather tedious and patronizing address to Molly Maguire's children. And you can see the list goes on forever. It's a full scap list, and you can see that there 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's about 30 things you're not allowed to do, and these are handed out to the poor to the poor peasants. And they also use these presses to produce more mainline, semi-political posters, which also had a threatening undercurrent to them. They could be vaguely industrial. There were several that were produced about the against the coal mining operation in the centre of Ireland. This is against the visit of the Lord Lieutenant, the Red Earl, and people are told to bar their doors and close their blinds when the Lord Lieutenant came to town. Threatening letters were seen as giving fair warning, or so justifying what the next step would be, which generally, as I say, did not materialize. They were a satisfying stage between spreading rumor, as I say, and actually having to risk, the full weight of the law. Because there's one thing sending a threatening letter, it was another thing murdering an individual. And despite a lot of what was said at the time, there were relatively few murders in 19th century Ireland. Ireland was most certainly not the murder capital of the world, as it was the threatening letter capital of the world. Threatening letters primarily related to the possession of land, to grazing rights, and to employment in particular of foreigners. And by foreigners, I don't mean French or English or anything like that. I mean a man from the next county, or even in one case that I found in the National Library, and both the National Library and and especially the National Archives in Dublin, have a magnificent collection of threatening letters. There's a wonderful box that you must, if any of you are interested, you must go into the archives and get Brian Donnelly to dig it out for you, of about 300 of these threatening letters that were collected from the West Meath area. And it's a real treasure trove. Anyway, one of the letters that I found in the National Library related to road making, and the poor old magistrate had employed men this is in Tipperary, had employed men from about 10 miles away, and this just was not on. This was not acceptable. This was not going to happen. And there was magnificent threatening letters, one of the finest threatening letters I've ever read, with some superb threatening art that was produced. I think to no purpose, because the magistrate was fairly level-headed and tough individuals. Threatening letters were written because it became a recognized way of dealing with a land dispute. Because the writer or the writer's friend could write. You can't have a threatening letter if you can't campaign, if you don't have a society where people can read and write, and where it could be easily delivered without risk to oneself. The introduction of the penny post was a key moment in the development of the threatening letters and the graph going up. And the national post office system operated to communicate these threatening letters. But you had to be careful, because the postmistress was a very astute lady, very astute woman, and she would recognize who had bought stamps and would willingly speak to the constable if he called and asked about this letter. You know, who do you think posted it here? And she said, oh yes, that was old Paddy McGill. He bought one stamp, the mean old thing, and put it on the letter. That would be him. Now you had to be careful, and that led to the development where the letters tended to be. You would buy the stamp in your local post office, and then you'd go to the next post office, or even better, the next county. A lot of the Westmeath guys went into Roscommon, or way over to Mullingar, a big town. You wouldn't be noticed there, and they posted the letters there. So if you look at that box of threatening letters in the Dublin archives, you can see that the postmarks, it does not necessarily match the area or where the field that is under dispute is being discussed, although you can bet your bottom dollar that it was there that the letter was written. It also must be commented that, and it's difficult to put this without being absolutely direct. It's difficult to comment that one gets a very distinct impression that a considerable number of these letters were written when alcohol had been consumed. It's not just the poor English and the bad spelling and what you have. It's the language that is used in the pub when you're denouncing someone and you've had liquor. Very difficult to actually put your finger on, but just a general impression that you get. Now, Lord Chesterfield might say that the gentlemen of Ireland are never so fit for doing business as when they are fit for doing nothing else. And that probably is true when it relates to threatening letters. The whole iconography of the threatening letter is particularly fascinating. There is a sameness about these letters and their content. The whole issue of the stamp, and I put this one on. It's a lovely letter to Paddy Duffy, who was a traitor to justice and an assister of tyrants, and was put in his post box. And you can see that the writer has not posted it, but has gone to the effort of drawing in a stamp of Victoria's head and written Victoria, so that we know that it's a proper letter that has been written. They were generally, this perhaps is a, no, we'll come to another one where we have the envelope, the proper envelope. They were generally speaking a single sheet, and they were generally put in a single envelope. They rarely were over 100 words in length. They were always in English. I've never come across one in Irish, never come across one in Gaelic. Threatening letters often had bad grammar. They lacked punctuation. They lacked capital letters. You never know where one sentence stops and another sentence begins. They often had confused metaphors. Here's one I picked up. For the great O'Reilly, the time is short. The fish is near the bait. He has to watch his cork. You know basically what he's saying, but you know it doesn't quite come out right, especially at that time of night. They never ever contained swear words. Never found a swear word, and they were very rarely rude. There was moral rectitude. Now, John Westropp was threatened with the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah, but that is the only thing that comes anywhere close to any unpleasantness in any of these letters that I've read. Written in a stilted, pseudo-legalistic form, giving details and giving warning. Giving warning, I think, is the key. The message invariably evoked legitimacy and gravitas, combined pomposity, sweet reason, and moral rectitude with this staccato, pseudo-legal and blood-curdling English. Letters concluded with stylized viciousness and always a promise of death if one's demands were not met. However, that does not mean that one has to be uncivilized about the thing. And some of these letters were in a sense greetings, as well as being potents of death. For instance, this is a nice one. You can see the jolly shamrocks at the top of the letter. Very, very, very nice. And then another one from Rory of the Hills Aaron Gobach at the bottom of the letter. All this said, the letter and the notice, you know, it was a combination of civility and pleasantness. Put it that way. They were signed off by Captain Moonlight, Captain Rook, Captain Rock, or Rory of the Hills. I tried to do an analysis of how many of each, but it didn't quite work out because of the concentration that I had for one particular area where they always used the same sign off. So I didn't think it was a legitimate exercise. Very few of these threatening letters were sectarian. Very few. And very few were party political. There were occasional references to a bloody Orangeman, but you know, I don't really think one could. I wouldn't. Political, perhaps. I wouldn't think pushing it as sectarianism. The Church of Ireland clerics quite frequently received threatening letters, but in every instance, there was a matter of land ownership involved, where the rector owned a piece of land and there was dispute over that piece of land. So I don't really think you can call that sectarianism. Now, it does change. It does change in the 20th century when you get into the second decade and all that goes happens then. And there's a lovely file, a Scotland Yard file in London of threatening letters, which are much more classical than these ones that we have in Ireland, you know, where there's a bullet attached to the letter and where there's a little coffin, you know, and where there's a threat to behead Lloyd George, and there's sectarianism and anti-suffragette and pro-suffragette threatening letters. But that's a different ballgame, and that's a different age. Disguising handwriting is very common. Lovely flowing copperplate writing one finds, and one wonders sometimes about this illiterate English in others. To what extent, on occasions, was it deliberately illiterate to disguise the actual writer? We'll come back to that in a few seconds' time. The police were very cynical about the whole thing, and in fact were a bit irritated by the whole thing. You know, there was a lot more going on than having to chase around people who were writing these stupid letters, although they did chase around people who were writing these stupid letters. The RIC frequently believed that threatening letters were the work of the local village schoolmaster, out to supplement a meager wage. And there was a case in the village or the town of Tralee, where there was a cobbler who the police were convinced wrote letters, threatening letters. In other words, you could go along to the schoolmaster or the cobbler or whoever it was, and you could say, look, this character, Donal McCracken, he's occupying that field, and that's my field. Would you draft me a letter there? And they did. And, you know, it would be done either in this sort of style or in the illiterate style, so disguise the thing. And there you didn't have to worry, it would cost you a shilling or whatever it might be. Another thing, and I think one of the most interesting things about threatening letters was the threatening art. Coffins. You really hadn't a proper threatening letter unless you had a coffin. Now, this is a chap who had too much ink. And you notice the ones that have no ink or very little ink, and those that have a lot of ink. Coffins appear in lots of them. Shaded in coffins, coffins that aren't shaded in, but with little messages of their own written into them. The only example I have of a corpse in a coffin. Magnificent piece of threatening art. Guns, flintlocks, long-barreled flintlocks, pistols, and look at that one also. One has got a two-dimensional coffin, one has got a skull and crossbones, one has severed limbs, one has got powder all in a small little area. One has got a more modern rifle, and one has got powder, dry, and one has got your grave there as well. But this was the supreme piece of threatening art, and I actually cheered when I found it. I was told to keep quiet by the librarian, but you can see why I cheered. Isn't it magnificent? The detail, the humor, the snoring coming out of the coffin's heads, the read your face, the curlicues around it, magnificent piece of art. And one shouldn't be surprised about that, because it came from the Ordnance Survey office in the Phoenix Park. It was office politics. And one member of the staff wrote this to another member of staff. And in the end, they dealt with it as they often didn't deal with problems in 19th century Ireland. They didn't prosecute the fellow. They told him to go and go away and go to England. And it could be an English problem. Hats. As with the guns, the illustrations are often antiquated. They are looking back to a previous age, where you had pistols, not revolvers, where you had blunderbusses, you didn't have breech loading rifles. And there's a nice Regency drawing there, but from the 1880s. Action appears in some of these. He says his revolver is rusty, do not have me use it on you, blah, 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 blah. And there he is shooting the other fellow, and there's his grave beside him. I mean, you don't have to say, and that's signed by Tipperary Mountaineer. And a very strange one, a unique one from Sligo of all places, is Masonic symbols. And this brought in the Vatican, it brought in the Italian unification movement, and it brought in the poor old Sligo police. People kept their threatening letters. I know that some are handed in, but they generally kept them. Even though it was nearly a sign of bad luck. You know, the image of the squireen, you know, the Irish squireen crunching up his letter and throwing it into the waste paper basket, that didn't exist. They kept the letters, but they regarded them with contempt. And here's a lovely one of a letter where the guy has done some totting of sums, some financial tots on it. So, but he's keeping it, but he's using the bit of paper, so it has a use in the end. How did people react to receiving threatening letters? First of all, as I say, they tended to keep them because it was regarded as a bad omen to get rid of them. They often brought in the authorities, and I go into some detail in the book about the emergency men, which are something someone needs to write a book about the emergency men. They're been forgotten. The fact that they were regarded as outrage from the parliamentary party, the nationalist point of view, this was loudly denounced, because look at this graph. The long line is threatening letters, and the other types of outrage, you can see the numbers there. So basically the threatening letters skewed the statistics against, because these were used by the government and by the unionists to denounce nationalism. You know, this is what nationalism about. This is what home rule will bring you. It'll bring you lawlessness and blah 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 blah. What you know, if you grant these fellows a home rule or independence. And threatening letters were strongly denounced by the parliamentary party, who themselves often received or occasionally received threatening letters from their own followers, or the more advanced members of the nationalist group. Finally, did threatening letters writers get caught? Now, writing a threatening letter was a criminal offence. It had been a criminal offence since the 18th century. It was tightened up in the 19th century. The authorities took it seriously. Here's a wonderful map of Kerry, an outrage map of Kerry, according to the various districts. And you can see there, Killarney, Tralee, Dingle, you know, what have you. And in each district, they've written down the outrage and the number of outrages in the Pacific period. I think this is 1884. And you can just look at that and you can see where the trouble was taking place. But from my point of view, you can see which of the areas the threatening letters were being written and where they weren't. A lovely document. They also used the police newspaper, the bi-weekly hue and cry, the RIC, and the Dublin Metropolitan Police newspaper, a much underutilized and fascinating newspaper. They had rewards, £20 reward, a lot of money for information received for someone who'd been received a threatening letter. The police also investigated where they thought they could. Here is some guy who used old envelopes to write threatening letters. Now, the trouble with writing old envelopes is that they had the person's address on them. And the police, you know, the police are not completely stupid. And they, the name there, you can see just Bowe, I think it is, B-O-W-E, went along to Mrs. Bowe's house and started asking awkward questions. Though, interestingly enough, at the end of the day, even with this evidence, they weren't able to get a conviction in that case. They used handwriting experts. The magistrates and the judges were very, very dubious of handwriting experts who earned a lot of money and got lots of commissions and all that sort of things. That's a telegram to one of them. And they used photography. They photographed and you'll find this in the National Archive collection. This is a ledger of books where they have the threatening letter, and then if they can get a sample, and they went to some devious means to get samples of people's handwriting, they would put the two together so they could see if there's a correlation between the handwriting and the threatening letter. And that's from the 1860s. One knows about photography. They used, you know, those volumes of the Fenian portraits that are in the National Archives, but it went beyond that. The police were Anderson and later on Anderson and Co. were using photography for identifying handwriting. Though the police often knew who was responsible, conviction rates were extremely low. For example, in 1848, of 1,800 cases of threatening letters reported, there were only 33 arrests. And out of those 33 arrests, there were only 6 convictions. These convictions ranged from 7 years transportation to 2 months in prison. And very shortly after that, into the 1850s and certainly into the 1860s, those who were convicted, the punishments became less and less. So by the 1880s, it is basically a nuisance crime, and it's 2 weeks. If you're unlucky and you're a diehard on the bench, it would be a month in the local bridewell. The tradition of sending threatening letters declined in the 1890s, but it lingered on into the suffragette campaign and the War of Independence. But it never became quite extinct. And I remember drinking in a bar in Camden Street with a member of the Supreme Court in Dublin, in Casey's Bar, and he's telling me that even today, you know, that they received threatening letters. In 1920, one police officer reported a threatening letter. The turf bank belongs to T. O'Connell, the turf bank belonging to T. O'Connell was damaged by letting water into it. And anonymous letters received by O'Connell and his labourers warned them to let Maloney's turf alone. Maloney claims this turf bank. You know, there are some things in Ireland that never change. So I'm very grateful to Ronan Colgan and Eastwood Books for having produced such a lovely volume. It is a very nicely produced volume, whatever is written inside it, because I think this is something that it's a curiosity, but I think it's a curiosity that deserved an airing. Thank you very much indeed, Donal.
Thank you so much, Donal, for that entertaining talk. I noticed at the end you touched on the War of Independence and the suffragettes. I remember reading in one history of the British suffragettes that the king was none too happy to be receiving letters in the post from suffragettes threatening to shoot him. So they were fond of sending the odd threatening letter during that campaign. In terms of questions, I got a couple that have come in. Sean asks, fascinating stuff, Donal. Has modern day anonymous accounts on Twitter, do they serve the same purpose as the Victorian threatening letter?
Oh dear, yes, indeed. I'm afraid so. But Twitter is so vulgar. These guys were much more civilized. They were able to communicate their hatred and their vile in a much more civilized fashion than Twitter does it. So I think it is to. But yes, it is the modern Twitter. The lack of restraint, I suppose, and the attitude underpinning it. But a threatening letter was a serious business, and it was a personalized business. Whereas I think a lot of the Twitter is just people's prejudices and anxieties coming out. This hadn't anything to do with prejudice and anxieties. It had occupying that bloody field over the fence.
Yes, it's far too easy to set up an anonymous Twitter account as well, by comparison to taking the time to write a letter and send it. Caroline says, with Tipperary having the highest number of threatening letters in the given time period, was it really found Dublin had second lowest of all counties? And if so, given populations, what's the explanation for that?
Yeah, well, because the explanation is it was a rural thing. Dublin had very few. Strange enough, I came into this through Dublin. After I did that Boer War book, I was so fascinated by John Mallon, the police, the head of the detective division, Superintendent John Mallon of Armagh, of South Armagh, and he received lots of threats. Letters, which had absolutely zero impact on him. He was that sort of a man, except one which attacked his wife and said she was a drunkard, and at party she misbehaved and got loud and boisterous. And he didn't like that one at all. And woe betide the person who wrote that one. But generally, he let them go. So it was through Mallon that I came into it. But the number in Dublin, if you look at the statistics, the Dublin Metropolitan Police annual statistics, it's nothing. There's a dozen of them. And there's very, very few. What they had in Dublin were the informers' letters, the anonymous informers' letters. And but that's a different ballgame. That's not a threatening letter. That's betraying your brother and your sister. It's nothing to do with threatening letters.
Eileen makes a good point that the threatening letter is also part of the plot of even some contemporary novels, that it's kind of lingered on in the world of literature.
It's lingered on in the world of literature, and of course you find it in a different form. I must emphasize the point that England had a much more, the poisoned pen letter is vicious and nasty. It has no purpose apart from being vicious and nasty, whereas the threatening letter did have a very real, and sometimes the person had a case. If you're evicted from your farm, you want your farm back, whereas the poison pen letter is just evil. Strange enough, I don't think the word evil appears in the book, because I never really regarded these letters as evil. They were unpleasant, and they were something that had to be stopped if possible. But I think it was very much a society under strain, and you could get into that to what extent, because the famine obviously is horrendous. The land war in its own way is horrendous. And those are the periods where it peaks, and the letters also peak.
Frank asks, did the spike in letters in the early 1880s relate to any counties in particular?
Yeah, they related to the counties where a lot of the evictions took place. It would follow that pattern. There are squiggles. I've broken it down into counties, but also into provinces and nationally. But at any particular one time, it tends to be the same suspects, the same counties, even within the same counties. I mean, I could name villages in Moat. Oh, I nearly give the game away. In Wees and Westmeath, which are, whenever we drive through them, I say to Patricia, "This is a bad area. We're not stopping here. This is threatening letter country that we're in." Because it tended to be the same places that, and certainly the same counties where it took, and that's because it became a tradition. It became a ritual, and there's an awful lot of ritual behind this. And that's why the police were, they did what they had to do. But they always said about a policeman, you could always tell a policeman by the shine on his pants. And a policeman will do it if he has to do it. But this is nonsense. And they were more likely to go and say, look, we know your son was involved in this, and just tell him to stop it, rather than make it an official thing.
Did the letter serve as aggravating circumstance at the time if the threat was fulfilled?
Look, anyone who was assassinated or murdered, or whatever word you want to use, invariably had received threatening letters beforehand. So there is a link between where the crime did take place and threatening letters. And I came on no instance where there was an attempted, and there were far more attempted assassinations and murders than there were actual murders. The number of murders, they made the headlines, but for crying out loud, when you look at the world today, it was absolutely nothing. Ireland in the 19th century was a very, very safe country, and even Dublin with its underworld was not safer than certain parts of Dublin are today. Aggravating circumstances, well, then you get into the debate whether a landlord deserved his fate or not. There's some nice bits. It's rather sad in some places because some landlords were intimidated, and Kenmare, way down south, he was basically driven out, and the tenants actually paraded in the town against the threatening letters, but he said stuff it, and he boarded up the house, Kenmare House, and he went to London, and he dismissed half the staff, and became an absentee landlord because of this. And of course that impacted not only on the tenantry, but it also impacted on the town who supplied. And there was an example, where was it? I was just looking at it a few minutes ago of, I can't find it. There was an example of, during the famine, of a landlord who received a threatening letter. And he went to the tenantry and he said, unless you tell me who wrote this letter, and he had a pretty good idea who wrote this letter, I'm stopping all famine relief, which he did. So it could have serious implications. But really, when you look at the 36,000 letters which we have, the numbers where something was actually done was infinitesimal. It was tiny.
Mary, it's just an interesting question. I suppose wondering if there were any kind of racist issues around the letters. Did Black African people live in Ireland at that time, and did they receive any threatening letters? Any examples of racist threatening letters?
I didn't come on any, but a lot of the Black population would have been in Dublin, or in a social status either higher or linked to someone with a higher social status. But no, I must confess, I never came, and I would have been interested had that been the case. Yes, there was a Black population in Dublin, and it was until fairly recently airbrushed out of Irish history. But there again, you see, Dublin wasn't the place where these letters were taking place. You're talking about the most rural parts of the country, where they tended, and the whole thing about ownership of land, is not a simple thing. The farmer saying this is his hereditary land, and you dig down, and you find that 2 generations before, there's no sign of the farmer on that piece of land. It wasn't always what the politicians said that the situation was. But no, I must admit, I've never came on the race thing. If I did, I'd write a nice article for History Ireland on it.
So thanks to everyone who tuned in this evening and for their comments and questions. The book, You Will Die at Midnight, Threatening Letters in Victorian Ireland, is published by Eastwood Books, which I think it's a subsection of Wordwell.
That's right.
And they did a really beautiful job on it, you're right, and that deserves to be mentioned. The quality of production is fantastic. It's worth saying before we go, Donal, you've had another recent book on another fascinating subject.
I have, but I have 2 sorts of green history. One is Irish history, and of course, I am an Irishman first and last, and an Irishman in Africa. But the other one is botanical history and the garden history and forest history. And Kew Gardens have just published a book called Napoleon's Garden Island, about the old gardens and the botanical history of the island of St. Helena off the west coast of Africa, which was the entrepôt for all the plants coming in from China and India and Indonesia, and then on to Europe. They all holidayed, as it were, in St. Helena to recover. So but that's a different ball game and another lecture.
So the Boer War, threatening letters in Victorian society, Napoleon's Garden, and everything else you could ever want from one historian. Guys, there's one more Zoom in the Festival of History. That is tomorrow night. Chacan Ord Vera agus Ray Blood na Heron talk Osquelga on the Mansion House and its contribution to the Irish Revolution. That will be given by former Lord Mayor Micheál McDonagh. But for now, I just want to thank Donal for that really fascinating talk. Thank you all for tuning in. As I said, the 10th edition of Dublin Festival of History, and that was a really special talk from right across the world to mark it. So thank you so much, Donal. It's long.
Bye, folks.